Good evening, everybody, and welcome. As is our practice, we hope in the zchut of the learning that the 132 captives that still remain in Hamas terror dungeons, as it's being called, get brought home to their families, alive, safe, and well. We also are learning in the zchut of our soldiers, the pitzuim, people who have been wounded on the field of battle. May they have a speedy recovery. And of course, for the safety of our HaElohim, may they come home victorious and safe and sound to their families. And mostly we are hoping in the zchut of our learning that we achieve a complete and utter victory over our modern day Amalek. Last week, we talked about two different motivators that we need to get ourselves ready to serve God. And we said for a bunch of reasons, we as humans needed this hitorarut, this awakening, right? To get us to show our appreciation to the Kadosh Baruch Hu for everything he has done and does for us, and as a consequence, to do what he has asked us to do. And we said that this hitorarut could either emanate internally from within us or be externally imposed upon us, if you will. The internal motivator we called ahavat Hashem, and the external motivator we called yirat Hashem. And yirat, we said, was motivated either of a promise of a reward or out of fear of a punishment. So Yira, we said, was motivated for a promise either for a reward in this world and the next, or out of fear of punishment for not doing what we have been asked to do. And this Yira is imposed upon us by the Torah. And last week we also talked about the benefits and the limitations of both of these types of motivators, as they serve to be drivers for us to serve the Kodesh Baruch Hu. We also discussed the pros and cons of ahava and yira, and why in the end we needed both. In the end, the Chovot HaLevavot told us what we already knew, which was that service out of ahava was qualitatively better than service out of yira, but nonetheless, Ibn Pekuda said that Torah plays an essential role in helping us to achieve ahavat Hashem and to drive us towards avodat Hashem. And he listed several ways why this is so. Okay? So next, the Chovot HaLevavot takes a little detour off of the topic of avodat Hashem, service to the Kadosh Baruch Hu, and we will get back to that topic. But as long as we're talking about the benefits of Torah, Rabbeinu Bachya expands on his discussion of Torah, and specifically he's going to go over three things. One, he's going to give us a novel way to look at the mitzvot, right, the do's and don'ts of the Torah. He's going to present to us a hierarchy of learning Torah, right, starting from very basic to what he considers the pinnacle. Lastly, he's going to create a hierarchy in terms of emunah, in terms of belief and faith in the Kadosh Baruch Hu, also starting from lowest to highest. And although it's a little bit of a detour in the discussions from Ahavat HaElohim, the topics that he's going to introduce are worthwhile for us spending some time, and they will provide for us a foundation for some of the ideas that he's going to be introducing later on, and he's going to continue to go back to them. So let's enjoy the field trip. So we spent the last 2 weeks talking about how the Kadosh Baruch Hu gave us the Torah as a motivator for us to want to serve him and to help us grow spiritually, and as a chesed, to tell us what it is he demands of us, what he wants us to do. The Torah, in the end, is a book of halachot that lists the do's and the don'ts. And last week we read about, in last week's parsha, we read about the first do that we got in Parshat Bo, which was the mitzvah of Kiddush HaChodesh, right? That we should bless Rosh Chodesh. And Rashi tells us in his first comment in the Torah that the Torah could have started with HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem, with that mitzvah. Now, there he gives a reason why it doesn't, and it's beyond the scope of what we're going to talk about today. But you could make the case, according to Rashi, that indeed the Torah is really there to give us the do's and don'ts and to list out all the halachot that we are responsible for. And Rabbeinu Bachya says that this way of looking at the Torah is really too narrow. We need to understand that the Torah was given to us as an all-encompassing guide to serve as a model and as a driver and as a guide for our service to the Kodesh Baruch Hu. So how exactly does this work? So he starts out telling us what we already know. He says there are 613 mitzvot, within which 248 are things we are commanded to do, and 365 are things we are not commanded to do. And as he has told us over and over again, these mitzvot are divided into mitzvot of the heart, emotional mitzvot, and mitzvot of the limbs, which are mitzvot that we need to do. But he said, but mitzvot we need to do, right? Physically do with our bodies. But he says there's another category of human activity that's not addressed directly by the Torah. And as we'll see, this might be the most important category of activity. So he writes in source 1, the Torah divides all human activities into 3 groups: commands, prohibition, and permitted activities. So what a command is pretty clear. What a prohibition is also pretty clear. But what is this permitted activities that he's talking about? So according to the Chovot HaLevavot, permitted activities are our day-to-day activities that we do to keep ourselves alive. These are things like eating and drinking and sleeping and talking and making a living, having marital relations, etc. There is no positive mitzvah that tells us to eat or sleep, right? There's no positive mitzvah that says we need to earn a living. And mostly there's no positive mitzvah because it's obvious. The Torah doesn't have to tell us that. And things that are obviously allowed, the Torah doesn't need to spend time on, right? It just assumes that these are things that we're going to do. Now, it is true that the Torah does legislate some of these activities, things like kashrut and the laws of nida and lashon hara and the laws of how we should conduct our business. But largely, the field is left up to us, right? I mean, if you think about it. So the Ramban, who lived about 100 years after the Chovot HaLevavot, coined a phrase that's called naval birshut haTorah, which means a disgusting person who keeps all of the mitzvot. Right? And meaning that within all these areas of permitted activities that we're discussing, eating and drinking and having marital relations, one could live a complete debauched life and not commit one avera in the Torah. So, for example, he writes in Parshat Kedoshim in Sefer Vayikra, he said one could be a drunkard only drinking kosher wine. One could be a glutton only eating kosher food, right? You could go to the individual and say, that's not right. And they'd say, well, what exactly did I do wrong? I'm drinking permissible wine, so I'm drinking to excess. Where does the Torah say that you can't drink to excess? And living like this is technically within the letter of the law, but as I described it to you, I could tell on your faces that you know that it's not within the spirit of the law. And it's the spirit of the law that's also important. There are things that we can do, but we shouldn't. The way my grandmother would have put it would have been spasnish badir. It's inappropriate for you, right? You're not an individual who behaves like this. And the Rambam says is that we need to impose upon ourselves something that we're going to spend a lot of time, in fact, an entire Shaar, on prishut, right? Restricting ourselves in terms of things that are permitted because they're really in the end not appropriate. And the Rambam calls this kedoshim tihiyu, kind of a catch-all mitzvah to give us an idea of how we should live our lives within the rubric of Torah. Now, the Chovot HaLevavot takes this idea that we need to look at how we perform these day-to-day activities, not only as an end in itself, but because how we conduct them impacts on how successful we can be in our Avodat Hashem. So he says that we can conduct these activities, we can put these activities that are permitted in one of three categories. One, do we do them to meet our needs, or I'm going to call them sufficiency? Do we exceed what we need, and I'm going to call that excess? And do we withhold so that we're not even meeting our needs? And for the sake of this discussion, we'll call that deficiency. So here's what he writes about sufficiency in source 2. That which meets with one's needs is that which is indispensable to a person for the preservation of his body or the management of his circumstances, such as food and drink, clothing and shelter, speech which he needs to conduct his business activities and commercial transactions, and all kinds of physical movements, all these employed according to the need and in proper measure so as to secure one's welfare. Restricting our activities to what is necessary. Now, as an aside, one of the things that I know I struggle with, and we're all going to struggle with throughout this Sefer, is what does this word necessary mean, right? It doesn't seem to have enough of a definition. And in the Sefer itself, I know I'm just reading snippets, I read to you how he defines it. And in many places, we are going to feel that as he describes necessary, it's going to sound like he is advocating an aesthetic life. And I don't think that he is, but for now, let's keep this idea as necessary kind of open-ended and let's not be judgmental in terms of where it falls. So these are things we need to do to stay alive, earning a living, eating, sleeping, etc. Excess, on the other hand, is close to what the Ramban calls naval b'shut haTorah, being disgusting with the permission of the Torah. But Ibn Pekuda is much more expansive in terms of what falls into this category. So if you look at source 3, excessiveness in things permitted is where one crosses the limit of necessary into superfluous. What a man has no need for, such as overindulgence in food and drink, also extravagant adornment and dress, overly large homes, excessive talk, in which one cannot be sure that one will not stumble. And he brings, I don't bring the sources, but he brings a pasuk from Mishlei talking about people who talk too much get themselves into trouble. They begin to say things that they shouldn't. He also said, to this regard, in terms of sexual immoderation, further examples of excessiveness are striving to multiply possessions and to accumulate money. Shlomo HaMelech said somebody who has 200 wants 400, right? There is, in terms of money. There's no end to it. So the question is, there is a point beyond which it becomes excessive and it begins to draw us away from the spirituality and from serving the Kadosh Baruch Hu. And the Chovot HaLevavot actually has a different take from the Ramban in terms of why we should restrict ourselves and keep to only what we need. Ibn Pekuda says that excess in life's activities, prevents us from fulfilling the mitzvot that leads us to having a close relationship to the Borei Olam. Somehow, in excessive possessions and excessive materialism and overeating and over drinking, pulls us away from where we should be in terms of our relationship to the Kadosh Baruch Hu. And he says, all of these superfluous things we mentioned, which are for the improvement and enjoyment of the body, transform in the end into evil because they mislead one to that which the Creator warned us against and forbade, as written, and Yeshua grew fat and kicked. You have grown fat and you have grown thick and you are covered with fatness. And he forsook God who made him and lightly esteemed the rock of salvation. We'll talk about that pasuk in a minute. But in other words, he says that in the battle between the guf and the neshama, between our spirituality and our physicality, right? It favors the guf at the expense of the neshama. Now, there's a wonderful story that they tell about it's actually a Native American, a Cherokee Nation story, American Indian, American Native American, I guess that's more politically correct. And it's a grandfather talking to the son. And the grandfather says to the son, he says, my son, I have in me two wolves. One is kind and loving and helpful, and the other one is fierce and jealous and angry. And they're fighting to the death. So the grandson said, and which one will win? And the grandfather said, the one you feed. So excess feeds the guf at the expense of the neshama. To go back, the pasuk that Ibn Pekuda brings as a proof text is part of a nevuah that Moshe Rabbeinu brings at the end of Sefer Devarim in Parshat Ha'azinu. It goes, Vayishman Yeshurun v'yavat, and Yeshurun, we are Yeshurun, will grow fat and they will kick, meaning they will try and leave the Kadosh Baruch Hu. Shamta avita kasita vayitosh Elohai asa'u vayinabel tzur yeshuato. Meaning that when we get successful, it is at that point that we begin to leave the Kadosh Baruch Hu. Now, we are a very strange people. And I think that if I asked for hands, I don't think I would see any hand that didn't go up. When things go well for us, individually and as a community, right, and in the material sense, right, we're making money, things are peaceful, all the goodness that the Kadosh Baruch Hu promised us, he gives us, that's when we tend to leave him. You would think it would be the other way around. In bad times is when we turn to him. And we say, Keli, Keli, lama azavtani, God, why have you abandoned me? You would think that we would want to turn to him out of gratitude. So Ibn Pekuda would say, it's not ingratitude that is pulling you away. You're feeding the wrong wolf. Last category, deficiency. So it's kind of a strange category. The HaLevavot adds this category of permissible activities that the Ramban does not have, and that's what happens if you choose not to go to excess, but rather to restrict yourself and not take advantage of all the things that the Kadosh Baruch Hu allows us to do. And he explains. He says, when a person denies himself what is sufficient in food and drink, clothing, material, marital relations, speech, sleep, or earning a living. So it's not that I'm going on a diet, but I am having less than I need. I am really living this aesthetic life. So now you have to ask yourself the question, in terms of feeding the wolf, Is this a good thing or not? Okay? So he says, like any good rabbi, it depends. Correct. You could give this, you see, it depends. It depends on why you are imposing this preshut, this restrictions upon yourselves. You have to ask what your motivation is. If you're restricting yourself in an attempt to work on your spirituality and to deprioritize your guf over your neshama, then it can be considered a good thing. On the other hand, if you're doing it as a way to either gain praise or other worldly physical benefits, then it's a bad thing. And he says it's even reprehensible. Specifically, this is what he says. When this is when you are restricting yourself for worldly considerations to save money, or to be praised as one who abstains from what is permitted and takes from the world less than his bodily substance, it is contemptible. For he departs from the middle path, harms his body all out of excessive love of this world. One of the wise has said, whoever abstains from the world for love of the world, he is like one who put out a flame with a straw. I love that quote. I was not able to find its source, the only place I found it, but it probably was an adage that he had in Spain. So he brings psukim from Kohelet and Mishlei, right? Mishlei Proverbs, both written by Shlomo HaMelech to prove this point. One from Kohelet says, Al tivahel al picha velibcha al yimaher lahotzi davar lifnei Elohim, ki Elohim b'shamayim ve'ata al ha'aretz al kein yiyu dvarecha me'atim. Keep your mouth from being rash and do not let your throat be quick to bring speech before God. Be careful on how much you say and what you say. For God is in heaven and you are on earth. That is why your words should be few. In other words, in many situations, being restrictive in terms of what you say in your speech or moderation in speech is a good thing. Sefer Mishlei says, Ma'at shenot, ma'at tenumot, ma'at chibuk yadayim lishkav. A bit more sleep, a bit more slumber, a bit more hugging yourself in bed. But come upon you and want like a man with a shield. Meaning that if you go to excess with these things, you're going to pay a price for it. At the end of the day, the Torah, he says that the Torah is a book of do's and don'ts, and everything falls into a category of something that is mutar, permitted, or asur, forbidden. Even day-to-day activities, depending on where you fall into them in terms of sufficient, excess, or deficient. So before we move on, I want to point out an idea that he just mentions in passing, and this is an idea of the middle path, right? And he says that if you go to excess, you're not on this middle path. And he says not being on the middle path is contemptible. Now we know this idea of middle path or Shvil HaZahav from the Rambam, right? He was born just after or around when Ibn Pekuda was nifter. And in his Hilchot Deot, he talks about this golden mean or Shvil HaZahav or middle path. And I think it's worthwhile to take a look at what he says to give us a fuller view of what Ibn Pekuda is. So permit me, I'm just going to read the English if that's okay, although we have time. It says, there are two extremes of each trait, which are at a distance from one another. They do not reflect a proper path. It is not fitting that a man should behave in accordance with these extremes or teach them to himself. If he finds that his nature leads towards one of the extremes or adopts itself easily to it, or if he has leaned on one of the extremes and acts accordingly, he should bring himself back to what is proper and walk in the path of good men, and this is the straight path. So in this part, he says that there is a middle path. There are extremes. Extremes aren't good. If you find yourself on the extreme, go back to the middle. So now he goes on to explain what is this middle path. The straight path, this involves discovering the midpoint of temperament of each and every trait that man possesses within his personality. This refers to the trait which is equidistant from either of the extremes without being close to either one of them. That's kind of the definition of middle. Therefore, the early sages instructed to a man to evaluate his traits, to calculate them, and to direct them along the middle path, so that he will be sound of body. For example, he should not be wrathful, easily angered, nor be like the dead without feeling. Rather, he should adopt an intermediate course. He should display anger only when the matter is serious enough to warrant it, and in order to prevent the matter from occurring. Similarly, he should not desire anything other than that which the body needs and cannot exist without. He brings Mishlei, the righteous man eats to satisfy his soul, which is very much in line with what Ibn Bakuda just told us. He also shall not labor in his business except to gain what he needs for immediate use. And he also brings something from Tehillim. A little is good for the righteous man. He should not be overly stingy, nor spread his money about, but he should give charity according to his capacity and lend to the needy as is fitting. He should not be overly elated and laugh excessively, nor should he be sad and depressed in spirit. Rather, he should be quietly happy at all times with a friendly countenance. The same applies with regards to all other traits. This path is the path of the wise. Every man whose traits are intermediate and equally balanced can be called a wise man. Now, you'll notice the Rambam goes beyond what Ibn Bakuda told us to include not just activities, but traits. Angry, happy, sad, generosity. The problem is that we know that if we deviate from the middle path, we should go back to the middle. But how do you know if you've deviated from the middle path? I mean, how do you know where you are? And how do I know if I have found the right balance or not? Now, the Rambam says if you find yourself out of balance, then bring yourself back, which is all well and good, but not very helpful. The Chovot HaLevavot, in discussing this middle path, tells us this. This is what we need to do. An intelligent individual is one who weighs his actions before he does them, according to this standard, who first evaluates them with his mind and then chooses what is good among them and giving up the rest. In other words, we have to live, and this is outrageously difficult. It is very hard for us to pay attention to what we do and what we say. That is perhaps one of the hardest things that is in front of us. There's a book that was written by this Rabbi Joseph Telushkin, Words That Hurt, Words That Heal, which is a popular way to bring out the ideas of Lashon Hara and the Chafetz Chaim. And he puts a challenge at the end of his book. And he says, for 24 hours, pay attention to what you say. And if you're going to tell a story, before you tell it, think about what your motivation is in telling the story. Right? Is it because you need to give information? Is it to aggrandize yourself? Is it to make somebody else look bad? And then tell the story. But at least be ready. So I did this. And number one, I was incredibly disappointed in how many of what I was going to say didn't fall into this is important information for people to know. But more than that, it's exhausting. It's exhausting to pay attention. And Ibn Bakuda is telling us that we have to look at our next purchase. Why am I buying this? Do I need it or do I not need it? right? If I'm going to order something in a restaurant, am I hungry or am I not hungry, right? And to judge it based on that. Now, the other thing that you need to do is if you're going to partake in an activity, you have to ask yourself, is this activity going to bring me closer to the Kadosh Baruch Hu or not? Is it going to detract from my Yirat Shamayim? Is it going to enhance my Yirat Shamayim? Or is it going to be neutral? And if it's going to be neutral, is neutral good enough? Right? And if we weigh everything that we do according to this standard, we'll be able to find the middle path. And we'll be able to see whether we are doing things that we need, that we really don't need, or are we being mitzomtzem? Are we holding ourselves back needlessly? So as a proof that this is what we should be doing in the approach, he brings a pasuk from Mishlei, from Tehillim, which is David HaMelech, and this is Tehillim Kuf Yud Tet. We brought a lot of citations last week from this Tehillim, so we're going to keep the ball rolling. He says, Chishavti darkai v'ashiva raglai el edotecha. I have considered my ways and I have turned back to your decrees. And the next pasuk says, Chashti v'lo hit mahamati lishmor mitzvotecha. I have hurried and not delayed to keep your commandments. Meaning once I have evaluated my actions, I have chosen a path that's going to bring me back to this middle path. Questions, comments?
Oh, sorry. Just about anger, because a lot of people say like you should never manifest anger, almost never manifest anger. There's a middle path. You said you don't want to act like you're dead when somebody does something that legitimately should make you angry.
If you look at what the Rambam says, he doesn't say you shouldn't get angry. He says he, meaning one, should display anger only when the matter is serious enough to warrant it. Now, that's a shiur for another time in terms of what the Rambam thinks that is, but it's not nothing.
It's not never. Okay.
It's not
some
never.
People will say like we should never be. No, if we're trying to act in God's image, like we should try to temper our anger.
And I think that that's true, but there are times when it's warranted. Right? Maybe we'll do that. Maybe we'll take a break and we'll look at that issue. But it's not never. And the Rambam lists out parameters. The way I had always learned it is if you're going to get angry, go get angry on purpose. Right? That there's a purpose to your anger and it's not out of control. The Gemara tells us that somebody who gets angry, it's as if they worship Avodah Zarah. Why that is, it's a shiur for a different time.
Okay, I'll go to the.
If you find yourself out of balance at an extreme and you need to bring yourself back in the middle, that presupposes that you know that you are not in the middle. And I think many people, you're already knowing that you've got to do something different if you have the self-recognition to say, I have to come back to the middle.
I think that's true. And as I was putting together, I was struggling with that point. But there is a mitzvah that is on all of us called tochacha, which they translate as rebuke. And it means that if you see a friend who is at an extreme, you have a responsibility to help bring them back. Right? We have an idea that it means sitting there and yelling at them and saying, no, you shouldn't do this and undo. But no, what we would call it today is an intervention. Right? Sometimes people are at a point where they need to be shown that they are at an extreme. Because you're right, if I recognize them at an extreme, I'm probably not at an extreme. That's why we have communities. But it's a good point. Anybody else? Okay. Now, next topic. Rabbeinu Bachia now shifts gears, and he presents us with a continuum of different approaches to Torah. He presents us with 10 levels of people who learn Torah from low to high. And I say it's a continuum because you're going to see later that it's fluid, right? People can move and progress. And when I see the word levels, it sounds very static to me, that if you're on level 1, you're going to stay in level 1, which is an idea I don't think he subscribes to at all. And while he presents them as 10 separate levels, I think we can kind of group them into 3 basic categories of basic, intermediate, and advanced. Ooh, good. So the basic category are individuals who relate to Torah, right? And here when I say Torah including Tanakh, and they relate to it just as a text. They don't understand the words, they don't speak Hebrew. So these folks don't understand Hebrew. Remember, Chovot HaLevavot was written in Arabic. So I'm not sure the level of Hebrew literacy in his time, like in our time. I don't know how high it was. So nonetheless, they realize that this is a holy text. They realize is it important, and they do their best to read the text. But in doing that, they're not so careful, right? These are people who study the Tanakh, and they're happy just with their ability to read the text, but they don't understand what they're reading. That's the most basic level. It means that they know the Hebrew letters. The next level within this category are people who try to read correctly, and they're very careful in following the vowels, and who concentrate most of their efforts on learning the nikud and learning the trop and being able to make the sounds so that they are correct. In reading these two, they sound pretty similar, right? It's hard if you just read the text to try and differentiate between this level 1 and level 2. But I think the difference is, the way he describes it, is level 1 is satisfied where they are, and level 2 is not. Level 2 is making an effort to improve. Level 3 is people who recognize that it's not enough just to read the text, but they want to understand kind of the grammar behind the text. They're still not understanding the Hebrew, but they want to understand the structure, shvarna, shvarnach, and why this word is put before this word without even knowing what it is. So before we go on, he lists these 3 as the first 3 levels of learning Torah. So we have to ask ourselves the question, is there any real value in learning Torah this way? Right? If somebody came to you and they fell into one of these categories, people who didn't understand the language and just reading it for the sake of reading it, even though they know it's like they're saying incantations, I guess that's unfair, but you understand. Is there value to reading without understanding? So I'm going to open that up. What do you think?
Yes,
Okay, so what is the value?
as opposed, in my mind,
Uh-huh.
the value of reading Torah, even if you don't understand it, is balanced against not doing it at all.
Okay,
So if the choice is not doing it at all, or at least doing what you're capable of at that stage in your life, then that's better.
okay. I hear
Striving,
it.
obviously, to get more out of it is even better, but if you got that far, that's not nothing.
So there's something called Shaar halicha. Shaar halicha is the benefit you get from walking to shul. Right? Before you get to shul, the fact that you made that
That you
effort
made the effort.
is a benefit. So this is the analogy of a Shaar halicha. You're putting in the effort. Okay. Anybody else? Opposing? Well, it turns out that there is benefit to doing it. And learning Torah and reciting Torah and reading Torah on this level has a subliminal effect on our neshamot. The Hebrew language itself has power in and of itself, and just the recitation gives us schar, gives us benefit. The Balatanya, who was the first Lubavitcher Rebbe, said that if somebody recites the Torah or Tanakh, even without understanding it, if he moves his lips, he gets the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. In other words, it's not just reading with your eyes, but when you say it out loud, then you are doing an act. And since learning is an act, you get credit. The Shlah HaKadosh, who is Yeshayahu ben Avraham HaLevi Horowitz, 16th century Prague, says that as long as one knows that they're reading Tanakh, right, they're reading Torah and they're the Kitvei Kodesh, then he gets credit for learning. So I said before that there is power in the Hebrew language. Where it comes clearest is in Tefillah. The Gemara in Masechet Sota in the seventh parak, Elu Omrim, talks about things that need to be said in Hebrew only, and then things that could be said in other languages. The things that could be said in other languages are typically things that you need to understand. So statements in courts and documents. And they said that one of the things that you can say in any language is the Shema. Because since the Shema is the touch tone of our faith, then you should understand what you're saying, which makes a lot of sense. But the Gemara goes on to say, if you don't understand it, you're better off saying it in Hebrew, even if you don't understand it. Now that goes against what I just said. But there are two reasons that the Mishnah Berurah brings. One is because translations are terrible, and you've all heard me go on and on and on about translations, right? They translate Vayulu totafot beinecha. There should be like, okay, we don't know what totafot are. They're tefillin, but we don't know what that word means. So it gets translated as signs or frontlets. I don't know what a frontlet is. So the Mishnah Berurah says that if you say the word totafot, you're saying the right thing. If you say the word frontlets, then maybe. There's another idea is going back is that the words and the sounds have power in and of themselves. I was at a Shiur recently on Tefillah and on Kavanah, and they were saying it is like having a child in a tank, right, pushing all the buttons. So he'll push the button and the shell will go off and there will be an explosion, although he didn't know what he was doing, he was just pushing buttons. When we say tefillot and we recite the Hebrew, even if we don't know what we're saying, we're just pushing the buttons, so to speak, there's an explosion in Shemayim. Now clearly, it's better to know, but this level, this rudimentary level, this basic level, is still learned. Okay. Intermediate category. So this is the category above it, which is the beginning to want to seek understanding and meaning. So it includes people who were in the previous level, they know the grammar and they know the Hebrew, and they're beginning to look up difficult words so that they can begin to see a meaning in what it is they're reading. And they're beginning to see that the Torah has literal and figurative language and trying to get a better feel for what it is that they're learning. In this category are people to look to try and understand the metaphors, to try and understand the anthropomorphisms. What is the Torah trying to tell us? But they're only focused on Torah and Tanakh itself. The next level of people who seek understanding is trying to seek it through the eyes of the Amoraim, the eyes of the Tanaim, to understand what the Torah tells us through the Mishnah. And the next level are people who want to see the Torah through the eyes of the, through the Gemara. Now, they don't go into depth to it. They want to know the pshat. They want to understand what the Gemara adds, right? And that is kind of the intermediate level. The last level are people who learn Gemara at a very high level, and the last level, the 10th level in this, are people who are striving not just to learn the Torah and learn it in context, but to understand the secrets of the Torah and how it can impact how they behave, how it can impact their lives, to try and integrate these ideas of Ahavat Hashem and Yirat Hashem into their neshamot. So he says, the following is source 13, people who exert themselves to know the duties of the heart and the limbs and what is detrimental to right of contact, who understand the plain sense of the Holy Scriptures, the Kitvei Kodesh, as well as their inner meaning, who vary the truth of the, that can't be right. It says radiation, I must have copied it wrong. Based on scriptures and on reason, they are the Talmudic masters and the Gaonim who continue their predecessors' way. So the highest level of Torah learning includes individuals who have received wisdom of Torah from prophets, including the Perushim, the fundamental principles, meaning that they're learning from the Rishonim and Achronim. And they said after, this is the level of people who lived, who were the Anshe Knesset HaGadolah, and the rabbis who put out the Mishnah and the Braitot and the Gemara. So this last level is a very, very lofty, high level. So you have quite a continuum, and it would be my guess is that everybody falls somewhere along that continuum. Questions, comments? Okay. So he comes to the last of his digressions for this week. That makes it sound like he's going to have digressions next week. No, we're going right back to where we should next week. Is to enumerate the levels of emunah, the levels of faith, belief, that we can find ourselves in our relationship with Avodat Hashem. So here too, he provides us with 10 levels that we can group into 3 categories, or 3 classes. 1 are people who struggle with belief. 2, people who believe, but somehow their belief is faulty. And 3 are people who truly believe, right, at a very, very high level. So the lowest level he brings is actually pretty low. So these are atheists. These are people who reject Torah. They view it similar to customs that guide other peoples, right? Kind of atavistic things that other people should do, certainly not for them. And Ibn Pekuda quoted the pasuk in Devarim earlier, Vayishman Yishrum Vayivat, meaning when the guf takes complete control over the individual, it completely removes the Kodesh Baruch Hu from the equation. And this is what he opines causes a person to completely reject the Kodesh Baruch Hu. He stems, as he puts it, from the strong influence of sensual lust on their understanding and their coarse nature, and as a result, they refuse to believe in God or Torah. He wrote in the 11th century. My guess is that we could think of 1 or 2 individuals that we know that fall into this category. I could be wrong, just a guess. The next level includes individuals who acknowledge the signs and wonders performed by the prophets are true because they happened in public, right, in terms of the 10 plagues and all of the miracles they wrought, so you can't deny that. But they doubt and reject Torah. right? They suggest that God intended to guide people towards improvement in the world by giving them statutes through the prophet Moses, accompanied by signs and wonders to validate his message. But the Torah was written by man, right? 3 guys, J, P, D, E, L, X, Y, Z, LBQ. And as a result, there's no Kedusha to it. And if there's no Kedusha to it, then what do I need to follow it for? The next level in this are individuals who acknowledge the signs and wonders of the prophets, and it's true, and they accept that God gave us the Torah and that we need to keep it, but there's no consequences to it. There's no reward and punishment. If I keep it, great. If I don't keep it, okay. Right? There's no consequences to my keeping the Torah or not. So he says, the next people who accept it, okay. So he says, as the source 14, it is a grace of God for the improvement and guidance of his creators in this world alone, but not for reward and punishment in the next. The next category he has is what I'm calling faulty believers. People who believe, but there's a pagam, there's something wrong with their belief. So he says, people who firmly acknowledge the genuineness of Torah and truthfulness of reward and punishment in this world to come, and in the world to come, but are on the physicality side of the guf neshama continuum, meaning that they prioritize the love of this world over the next. And their observance of Torah is to obtain worldly rewards. In other words, everything I'm doing is for this world. And they express their commitment to the Torah and God and ruchnius with their tongues, but as he says, not with their hearts. The next level are people who accept and believe in God and Torah, and they're operating a level of yira, and they're looking for reward. And while it isn't ahava, we said yira is still a decent level, but these folks are operating on a deficient level of yira, and they are looking for praise and reward from the Kadosh Baruch Hu and from their neighbors. They want the Kadosh Baruch Hu to say, oh, what a frum guy this is, and they want their neighbors to say, oh, what a frum guy this is. So the next one are people who operate on the level of yira, but are looking for reward only in this world, and they don't believe in the world to come. The next one, they say that they believe in the reward in this world, next world, and they're operating on yira, but they don't accept or integrate ahava into their lexicon. And of that, we have a famous Mishnah in Avot that says, Antigonus ish Soho, Antigonus is the man who came from Soho, received the tradition from Shimon HaTzadik. He used to say, do not be like the servants who serve the master in expectation of receiving reward, but be like the servant who served the master without the expectation of receiving reward, and let, at the same time, the fear of heaven be upon you. In the interest of time, that the highest level is skipping the 8 and 9 is the apex of what the Chovot HaLevavot operates at. He says the 10th level, people who are certain in the truths of the Torah, and all of that they are subject to it in the way of reward for its observance and punishment for its non-observance in both worlds, who have awakened from their neglect and recognize in their hearts that they owe the Kadosh Baruch Hu his great favor and kindness towards him. They are not preoccupied with reward or punishment. Rather, they hasten to the service of God for his sake alone, to magnify and exalt him with longing and wholeheartedness on account of their knowledge of him and their grasp of his meaning. It is a very, very, very high level of belief. So, by looking at the expression on your faces, you are saying to yourselves, what is the point of these two lists and this digression that we took in Chovot HaLevavot, and you're thinking to yourself, is he like Charles Dickens getting paid by the word? So Ibn Bakuda has a goal with this. He is here to show us what is possible. He is saying, look at where you are today and understand there are levels to aspire to, and there is potential for everybody. The highest level of faith, he says, are these people who are certain in their faith. I don't know anybody who's certain in their faith, but it's possible. And if we want to reach it, we have to work at it. The Chovot HaLevavot in these two lists is presenting us with a challenge. He challenges us to grow in our learning of Torah, grow in our emunah to the Kodesh Baruch Hu. And he writes the reason for citing this list is to be useful to those individuals, meaning certainly everybody here, who are searching. And he writes, who they are searching for the straight path, when he finds among them a level that he is close to, he will know which level is above it, and he will try to ascend to it. The difference between his own level and the highest of all levels will be made clear to him, and he will attempt to amend to it level after level, right? That he wants us to grow in Torah. And he wants us to know what the pinnacle and what the goal is, and it's attainable and it's achievable if we work. In short, it's to show that we can always grow in Torah, we can always grow in our faith and relationship with the Kodesh Baruch Hu, and in the end, it's for striving for growth. I think the English poet Robert Browning, in his poet Andrea del Sarto, said, but a man's reach should exceed his grasp, or what's a heaven for? So, good evening, and we will see you next week. Thank you very much. Unless you have questions or comments, ideas? Great.